On February 13, 1945, at 22:03 hours, the air raid sirens of Dresden began their second wail of the night, and the Saxon capital's civil defense controller, Oberregierungsrat Theodor Elgering, logged the alert from the Albertinum command bunker. The Elbe carried a frozen mist that clung to the sandstone of the Brühlsche terrace. The Altmarkt smelled of refugee horses and wood smoke from the makeshift trek camps that had been pitched in the open square for 3 weeks. Above the old town, the silhouette of the Frauenkirche dome stood unlit against a clear winter sky. The story the post-war world inherited about that night fits in a sentence: a regrettable but militarily justified raid. The data layers the sentence omits are not obscure. They are documented, they are filed. They have been readable by any researcher with a reading room ticket for decades. The city's population had swollen by an estimated 200,000 refugees above its 1939 census of roughly 630,000. Civilians fleeing the Red Army's January 1945 advance through Silesia and East Prussia. Most slept in railway concourses, in school gymnasiums, in church naves, and in the open. The heavy 88mm flak batteries that once ringed the Saxon capital had been stripped for the Eastern Front in January, their crews and guns redeployed per Bundesarchiv records. And on February 1, 1945, Dresden had been entered onto the British Bomber Command target list, circulated to 5 group. RAF Bomber Command Operation Order, February 13, 1945, 796 Lancasters of 5 group and 1, 3, 6 and 8 groups dispatched. First wave at 22:13 hours, 244 aircraft target indicators dropped over the Ostrager Hague. Second wave at 01:23 hours on February 14, 529 Lancasters timed for fire crews already on the ground. The following day, 311 US AAFB-17S of the 1st Air Division crossed the city at 12:17. Air Marshal Sir Arthur Harris had signed off on the directive language. Churchill's minute of March 28, 1945 would later disappear from public-facing histories for decades. Master Bomber Group Captain Maurice Smith would order the second wave's aiming point shift over the radio, and a 17-year-old named Götz Bergander, sheltering on the western edge of the city, would survive a raid whose casualty figure he would spend the next 40 years trying to correct, against a number the regime itself had inflated, and the post-war world had been content to leave standing. Dresden, the city the war had not yet touched. In the winter of 1945, Dresden was the largest city in the German Reich that had not been bombed. The Ruhr had been hammered for 3 years. Hamburg had been cremated in July 1943 in Operation Gomorrah. Berlin had been struck more than 300 times. Cologne, Essen, Mannheim, Kassel, Magdeburg, all of them lay in industrial ruin by the start of 1945. But Dresden, the Saxon capital at 51.05 degrees north and 13.74 east, sat outside the routine arc of British heavy bomber operations. It had not been a priority. It had not been considered worth the fuel. The diversion of effort from the Ruhr campaign was not justifiable on any standing operational analysis. That changed in late January. The trigger was strategic, not moral. Yalta was approaching. The Western Allies were under political pressure to demonstrate materially and visibly that their air power was assisting the Red Army's winter advance into eastern Germany. The Soviet liaison delegation requested Allied air interdiction of rail and road communications behind the Eastern Front in the corridor through which the Wehrmacht was attempting to reinforce its collapsing front. Eastern German cities sat astride those corridors. On January 26, 1945, Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Portal endorsed the directive that would be circulated under the operational name Thunderclap. The targets were eastern German cities along the refugee and rail corridors: Berlin, Leipzig, Chemnitz, Dresden. The directive language survives in the UK National Archives under the AIR 14 and AIR 20 series at Kew. It has been readable for decades. The directive is not buried, it is filed. The British Air Ministry's December 1944 target dossier had already catalogued Dresden's industrial inventory. The Zeiss Icon Optical Works in Striesen, producing precision instruments for the Wehrmacht. The Sachsenwerk electrical plant in Niedersedlitz. The Friedrichstadt marshalling yard at 51.06 north, 13.71 east, 3 kilometers west of the Altstadt. On paper, Dresden was a legitimate node in the Reich's war economy. In material reality, it was something else. By February 13th, the city held more than 800,000 people. Most were not war workers. They were refugees from the east in Trek camps in the Altmarkt and the Grosser Garten, sheltering in cellars and railway concourses, waiting for trains that would not arrive. The night fighter cover that had once defended Saxon airspace had been pulled north and east in January 1945 as Luftflotte Reich redeployed. The Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv RL2 series records the redeployment in operational detail. The remaining flak was light, scattered and undermanned. By the second week of February, the city was materially an undefended refugee terminus. None of this was unknown to the planners. The intelligence had been compiled, the operational summaries had been read. The target maps had been printed at High Wycombe and distributed to the group headquarters. The target had been chosen, the directive had been signed. The air crews at Coningsby and Waddington had been briefed at 1400 hours on the afternoon of the 13th. Outside the briefing rooms, in the Lincolnshire dusk, the engines of the first wave were being warmed against the cold. The fuel had been loaded. The bomb bays had been closed. The order had crossed every desk it needed to cross. There was nothing left now between the directive on the page and the city under the cloud cover. Operation Thunderclap, the order that emptied the airfields of Lincolnshire. On February 13th, 1945, at 1730 hours, the engines of 244 Lancasters began their run-up at airfields across Lincolnshire and Yorkshire. Coningsby, Waddington, Skellingthorpe, Scampton, Bardney, Woodhall, Spa. The first wave belonged to 5 Group, the elite low-level marking force commanded by Air Vice Marshal Sir Ralph Cochrane, the same group that had carried out the Ruhr Dam raids of May 1943. The aircraft loadings are recorded in the 5 Group operational record book. Each Lancaster carried a 4,000-pound HC blast bomb, the so-called cookie, paired with clusters of 4-pound and 30-pound incendiary canisters. The ratio across the force was approximately 1:2 by tonnage, high explosive to incendiary. The high explosive opened the roofs and shattered the windows. The incendiaries did the rest. The flight path crossed the North Sea at 4,000 feet, climbed to 18,000 over the Belgian coast, dog-legged south over the Ruhr as a feint to draw German night fighters, then turned hard east into Saxon airspace. The diversion worked. The intercept controllers at Dielen vectored their fighters toward Bonn. Dresden, on its own approach corridor, remained unmolested. At 22:03 hours, the first siren in the Saxon capital sounded. L. Gearing in the Albertinum command bunker logged the alert. Cloud cover over the target was broken to 4/10. The Pathfinder force, working ahead of the main stream, had a clear sight of the city. At 22:13, target indicators went down over the Ostergehege sports stadium on the northwest curve of the Elbe. Red tea wine flares. The aiming point was not the Friedrichstadt marshalling yard 3 kilometers to the west. It was the Old Town. Master Bomber Group Captain Maurice Smith of 83 Squadron transmitted the run-in instructions over the marker channel. The first wave's bombs began falling at 22:14. For 24 minutes, the city was attacked. Then silence. The aircraft turned for home. The fire crews of Dresden, augmented by units from Berlin and Prague already racing south on the Autobahn, began moving toward the burning Altstadt. The Civil Defense After Action report, preserved in the Bundesarchiv, records the assumption Elgering and his staff made in those hours. The raid was over. Crews were dispatched into the streets. Pumps were positioned along the Elbe Quay. Casualty stations were opened in the Hauptbahnhof and the Johannstadt Hospital. Survivors emerged from cellars to assist with rescue work. Children were carried out of collapsed stairwells. The Hauptbahnhof itself, where thousands of refugees from the eastern transports were sheltering on the platforms and in the underground concourse, became one of the largest single concentrations of casualties in the city. 3 hours and 10 minutes after the first wave departed, at 1:23 hours on February 14th, the second wave arrived. 529 Lancasters from 1, 3, 6, and 8 groups. The deliberate gap between the two waves had been written into the operational order. RAF Bomber Command Night Raid Report. Number 836 records the timing without comment. The fire crews were in the streets. The pumps were running. The casualty stations were full. The Pathfinder marking for the second wave shifted east of the original aiming point into districts where the first wave's fires were creating a thermal updraft visible at altitude from 40 miles out. The master bomber instructed the mainstream to bomb the edges of the existing fire. By 0200 hours, the city's Old Town had crossed the threshold from a series of fires into a single firestorm. The temperature at street level in the Altstadt would, in the post-war reconstruction by the Dresden Civil Defense Office, be estimated at over 1,000 degrees Celsius in the central zone. The wind speed at the firestorm's perimeter exceeded the threshold for a self-sustaining convection column. Trees in the Grosser Garten were torn from the ground by the inrushing air. The asphalt of the streets liquefied. The columns from Berlin and Prague were still on roads they would not reach in time. 25,000, the figure the regime inflated and the world believed. Götz Bergander was 17 years old. He had spent the night of the 13th in his family's cellar on the western edge of the city, and he would spend the next 30 years counting. Bergander was not a soldier. He was a schoolboy whose father managed a yeast and spirits factory in Friedrichstadt. He survived because his neighborhood was outside the firestorm zone. He went into the streets the next morning. He saw what was there. And decades later, as a trained historian working from the Stadtarchiv Dresden and the Sächsisches Hauptstaatsarchiv, he would publish the first archive-based downward revision of the casualty figure. His 1977 monograph, Dresden im Luftkrieg, drew on civil registration entries, missing persons reports filed between 1945 and 1957, cemetery records, parish death registers, and the documented operations of the Altmarkt processing site. The figure he reconstructed was an order of magnitude lower than the number circulating in popular memory. The number he was correcting had not come from the Allies. It had come from the regime itself. On March 4th, 1945, less than 3 weeks after the raid, Joseph Goebbels signed off on Tagesbefehl 47, a propaganda directive that multiplied the casualty figure by 10. The internal Reich estimate, prepared by the Dresden police chief and forwarded through Reich channels in late February, had given a documented figure of approximately 18,000 to 25,000 dead, with the higher number presented as a maximum. Goebbels released the figure as 200,000. The directive language survives in the Bundesarchiv R55 series. The Goebbels diary entry for March 4, 1945, held at the Institute for Zeitgeschichte in Munich, records the calculation in his own hand. The figure was a weapon designed for neutral press in Stockholm and Geneva. By the end of February, the inflated number had crossed the front line. It appeared in Swedish wire reports. It was picked up in Switzerland. It entered the Allied press environment without a counterfigure, because no Allied authority was prepared to release the operational casualty estimate from a raid still being internally debated in London. The alt-marked operation had begun on February 21st. Understanding civil defense protocol, the recorded casualty figures were processed in the open square because the city's morgues, churches, and crematoria had been overwhelmed. The procedure was carried out under standing typhus prevention orders on rail grates assembled by SS personnel detailed to the operation from the Theresienstadt camp administration. The Sächsisches Hauptstaatsarchiv holds the documentation. It is filed. It is signed. It records what the regime called a sanitary measure and what the post-war trial preparations would call something different. The number on the regime's books before Goebbels reached the figure was already known to the Dresden police. It was approximately 25,000. That figure was the documented ceiling. It would remain the documented ceiling through every serious archival review conducted in the 70 years that followed. But the figure carved into the post-war imagination was not the police chief's number. It was the propagandists', and here is the part that the post-war consensus has never been able to explain away. The directive that produced the inflation has been readable in the Bundesarchiv since the Reich Ministry's files were inventoried by Allied occupation authorities in 1945. The internal Reich figure of 25,000 was on the Dresden police chief's desk before Goebbels saw it. The Stockholm wire service traffic that carried the inflated number into Western circulation was logged and archived by the Swedish Foreign Ministry. The cables are dated. The correspondents are named. None of the documentation was destroyed in the bombing. None of it was destroyed in the post-war inventory. The substitution of the propaganda figure for the police figure was not a clerical error. It was a political asset, released for an international audience and absorbed by it before any countervailing record had time to enter circulation. The consequence of that substitution had not yet been measured. It would take 65 years before the Saxon capital itself commissioned the work of measuring it. How the figure crossed the front line and became a Cold War instrument. On March 4, 1945, Joseph Goebbels signed off on the Tagesbefehl that would outlive him by 65 years. He would not survive the month of April. The man would be gone. The figure would not. The mechanism by which the inflated number entered Western memory has been documented by the historian Frederick Taylor, whose 2004 reconstruction Dresden, Tuesday, February 13, 1945, traced the wire service path from Berlin through Stockholm into the English language press. The Stockholm route was the first vector. Neutral correspondents filed the regime's figure as the only available number. The British and American occupying authorities, after May 1945, did not release a counterfigure. There was no political incentive to. The raid was already controversial within Bomber Command itself. Churchill's minute of March 28, 1945, in which he had asked whether the bombing of German cities for the sake of terror should be reviewed, had been quietly withdrawn after Portal objected to its language. The minute had been reissued in softened form. The original survived in the AIR 20 series. The softened version entered the public record. The pattern was set. The most memorable version became the version of record. After 1949, the figure acquired a second institutional sponsor. The East German state, through the SED Central Committee's commemorative apparatus, adopted Dresden as a centerpiece of its anti-Western narrative. The materials are preserved in the Bundesarchiv Sapmo holdings. The annual February commemoration in the Heidefriedhof Cemetery used the inflated number as a fixed reference point. School curricula in the German Democratic Republic taught the figure of 250,000 from the early 1950s onward. Memorial speeches by SED functionaries from Walter Ulbricht to Erich Honecker repeated it. The figure appeared on commemorative plaques, in newspaper editorials, in radio addresses on every February 13th anniversary. To revise it down would have been to surrender an instrument. The instrument was not surrendered. In 1963, the figure entered English-language popular memory through The Destruction of Dresden, a book published by the British writer David Irving. Irving, working from documentary sources he had accessed through correspondence with the Sächsisches Staatsarchiv between 1962 and 1963, reproduced a figure of 135,000. He sourced it to a document presented to him as Tagesbefehl 47, which had an additional 0 appended to the casualty number in its circulating form. Irving would years later acknowledge that the document was not authentic. The acknowledgement did not catch up to the figure. The book sold. The number entered libraries, encyclopedias, and the introductions of subsequent works. Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse 5, published in 1969, cited Irving's figure in its opening pages. The novel sold in the millions. The figure traveled with it. Documentary films produced for British and American television in the 1970s and 1980s repeated the number. Encyclopedia entries codified it. By the time scholarly historians began the slow process of reconstructing the casualty figure from primary archival sources in the 1980s and 1990s, the popular memory had been set for a generation. This is the second twist in the story, and it is a difficult one because it does not flatter any participant. The inflation was not a conspiracy of silence. It was a structural outcome. The regime pushed the figure for propaganda value. The neutral press absorbed it because they had no other figure. The occupying powers did not contest it because the raid was politically delicate. The East German state preserved it because it served. The English-language popular history industry repeated the loudest available number because the loudest number sells. No one had to coordinate anything. The system produced the result on its own. The archive was not destroyed. It was reduced to a sentence in the textbook. By 1989, the East German archives were no longer locked. Researchers could enter the Stadtarchiv Dresden and read the documents that had been there since 1946. The city itself, 15 years later, would commission the count. The Dresden Historians Commission and what 18,000 names mean. In the spring of 2010, the Dresden Historians Commission delivered a report that the city had commissioned 6 years earlier and that the world had needed for 65. The chair was Rolf Dieter Müller, then research director at the Military History Research Office in Potsdam, one of the most senior academic specialists on the air war over Germany. The commission contained 13 historians drawn from German, British, and American institutions. Their methodology was archival, granular, and unsensational. They reconciled, name by name, the civil registration entries of the Standesamt Dresden, the missing persons reports filed with the Volksbund Deutsche Kriegsgräberfürsorge between 1945 and 1957, the cemetery and Altmarkt processing records held in the Stadtarchiv, the parish death registers of the Lutheran and Catholic dioceses, and the refugee transit documentation that recorded who had entered the city in the weeks before February 13th and who had not left it. They examined the operational logs of the Dresden Civil Defense, the surviving fragments of the Standesamt's casualty card index, and the post-war reconstruction surveys conducted by the Dresden City Administration from 1946 onward. They interviewed surviving witnesses whose testimony had been preserved in the Stadtarchiv's oral history collection, and they cross-referenced the recorded statements against the documentary evidence. The work took 6 years. The final report, dated March 17, 2010, is held under the title Dresdner Historiker Commission Abschlussbericht. The defended figure was a range of 18,000 to 25,000 dead, with 25,000 set as a hard upper ceiling. The commission could not, even using the most generous reconstruction methods, produce a figure higher than the ceiling that had appeared in the Dresden police chief's internal estimate of late February 1945. The third twist in the story is that the commission did not discover anything. It reconciled. The documents had been on file in the Stadtarchiv since 1946. The Civil Registration Office had begun its work within weeks of the raid. The cemetery records were never destroyed. The alt-marked operation log was preserved. The Volksbund database, accumulating since the late 1940s, had cross-referenced missing persons reports against confirmed deaths for half a century. The granular historical reality has not been in dispute among specialists for over a decade. The popular delivery of it has lagged. While the commission was working, the rebuilt Frauenkirche stood in the Neumarkt as a parallel reconstruction project. The dome had been reconsecrated on October 30, 2005, after 15 years of work and more than 180 million euros in private and public funding. The reconstruction had used catalogued original stones recovered from the rubble after 1945, supplemented with new material where the original was missing or damaged beyond repair. Each stone in the catalogued set had been numbered, photographed, and reinserted in its original position where structurally possible. The reconstruction archive of the Frauenkirche Stiftung documents the procedure stone by stone. Of the approximately 3,800 original stones recovered, around 3,500 were placed back into the structure in their documented original positions. The dome that stands above the Neumarkt today is, in its load-bearing structure, materially the same dome that was destroyed in February 1945. It is also a different building because some of the stones are new. Both statements are true at the same time. Both statements are documented. Götz Bergander died in 2018 at the age of 90. He had outlived the regime that produced the inflated figure by 73 years, the Cold War system that preserved it by 27 years, and the publication of his own monograph by 41 years. The number he had reconstructed in 1977 was, with minor adjustments at the margins, the same number the Commission would defend in 2010. He had been correct from the start. The historian had counted. The propagandist had multiplied. The archive had held the count. The Stadtarchiv at the corner of Elisabeth-Buer Strasse holds the index cards. There are tens of thousands of them. Each one carries a name, a date, an address, and a notation of the source document that confirmed the entry. Each name is filed in the records the Commission used to establish the ceiling. At dusk in March, the dome of the rebuilt Frauenkirche catches the last light over the Neumarkt, and the figure of 25,000 stands in the air above the square as a documented ceiling, neither lowered by Allied apology nor raised by regime propaganda, neither softened by Cold War political utility nor inflated by popular history's preference for the loudest available number. The diary of Victor Klemperer, the Romance languages professor who survived the war in Dresden under regime persecution, records his entry for February 13th and the days that followed. He wrote at his desk in the cellar, on the road out of the city, in the chaos of the morning of February 14th. The Tagebücher were preserved by his widow Hadwig and published in full in 1995. They are held now in the Sächsische Landesbibliothek. The figure of 25,000 in the title of this account is not the propagandist's 200,000 and not the post-war shorthand's uncountable horror. It is the historian's documented ceiling. The archive did not lose the truth. The popular memory did. The dome was rebuilt from catalogued stones. The number can be rebuilt from catalogued names. In a steel cabinet in the Stadtarchiv, an index card bears a single name, a single date, a single address in the Altstadt, one card among tens of thousands. One name the inflated figure had erased and the documented figure has restored. The card is filed. The record is intact. The night of February 13th, 1945 is still there hour by hour in the order Elgering logged it from the Albertinum bunker at 22:03. This content is for educational and historical reflection purposes only. For academic citation, please consult the primary archival sources referenced.